Before the neon lights, before the rhythm of funk shook the dance floors, there was a voice smooth, soulful, and full of life. It wasn't the kind of voice you'd forget. It was the kind that stayed with you long after the record stopped spinning. He didn't come from the glamour of the spotlight, but from the quiet heartbeat of Los Angeles, where dreams were louder than reality. His sound carried the warmth of gospel, the groove of soul, and the raw pulse of funk. Yet somehow, his name slipped through the cracks of time. What happens to a voice that once made the world move when the music fades away? This is the story of Jerry Knight, a man who gave rhythm its soul and never asked for fame in return. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, and let's begin this journey together. He was born Jerry Ernest Knight on the 17th of April, 1952, in Los Angeles, California, a city already humming with rhythm and dreams. For a young black boy growing up in that world, music wasn't just a pastime. It was a language, a prayer, and sometimes the only way to be heard. In the small corners of his neighborhood, gospel floated out from Sunday churches. On the radio, Motown ruled the airwaves, and every teenager wanted to sing like Marvin Gaye or groove like James Brown. But Jerry, he was different. He didn't just listen, he studied. He wanted to understand how sound worked, how it could move people before a single word was spoken. By his early teens, Jerry had found his first love, the bass guitar. It wasn't the flashy instrument that got the spotlight, but it carried the heartbeat of every song. He practiced endlessly, teaching himself how to make the strings sing, not just thump. To him, the bass wasn't background, it was conversation. At home, his family encouraged him to chase something real. They knew he wasn't made for an ordinary life. There's an old photograph of Jerry from those years, a quiet smile, a small amp beside him, the kind of joy only music can give. That's the look of someone who already knows where he's headed, even if the world doesn't yet. In the 1960 decade, Los Angeles was becoming one of the most vibrant places for black musicians in America. Clubs in Crenshaw and Watts pulsed with energy, giving rise to a new kind of sound, something grittier than Motown but more melodic than funk's first wave. Young Jerry spent nights sneaking into shows, watching the players, memorizing their every move. He wasn't trying to be famous, he was trying to be good. By the time he turned 18, Jerry was already playing bass for local bands and small studio sessions. He had a reputation, the quiet kid who could keep any groove alive. Producers noticed his timing, his precision, and his ability to make other musicians sound better. It was a gift, but it was also a curse. The spotlight never found him, because he was always too busy helping someone else shine. In those early years, Jerry began to understand the balance between art and survival. The studio world could be brutal, long hours, low pay, little credit, but he didn't complain. Every take was a lesson, every mistake a chance to get closer to perfection. Somewhere around the mid-1970 decade, Jerry's name started circulating among musicians outside of Los Angeles. He played sessions that took him to Detroit and Chicago, where funk was growing into something electric and unstoppable. It was in these circles that he began to meet people who would shape his destiny. He would soon cross paths with another young man, a guitarist and producer, named Ray Parker Jr. The two shared a vision, to merge the precision of pop with the soul of funk. It was an idea that would soon redefine what radio sounded like in America. But before that, Jerry was just a young dreamer, standing behind a bass guitar in a smoky studio, believing that if he played hard enough, someone, somewhere, would hear him. He once said in an interview, "I wanted my bass to talk like a human voice." And it did. Every note carried intention. Every rhythm carried feeling. He didn't play to be heard. He played to make people feel. That's how Jerry Knight entered the world, not through fame or connections, but through the slow, honest climb of talent and persistence. He was a musician before he was a star, an artist before he was ever recognized. Before the gold records and the hit singles, there was just a young man from Los Angeles, his fingers on a bass, chasing a dream that sounded like freedom. By the mid-1970 decade, Jerry Knight had become one of Los Angeles's most dependable session musicians. He was the man other artists called when they needed their record to groove. Quiet, humble, and endlessly professional, that was his reputation. In an era where egos often filled the room, Jerry filled it with rhythm instead. It was around this time that fate stepped in. During a recording session, Jerry met a young guitarist and producer named Ray Parker Jr. Ray was already gaining recognition as one of the sharpest talents in town, a writer who could blend pop accessibility with funk sophistication. The two connected instantly. They spoke the same musical language, tight grooves, smooth harmonies, and melodies that could live both on the radio and the dance floor. Out of that friendship, a dream began to take shape. They wanted to create a sound that captured the spirit of funk but carried the polish of pop, something radio could play to the masses without losing its soul. In 1977, that dream became real. They called their band Raydio. Signed to Arista Records, Raydio arrived at a time when R&B was evolving fast. Disco dominated the clubs, funk owned the airwaves, and soul was still the heartbeat of Black America. Jerry's contribution was more than just a bass line. He was the grounding force of the group. His deep, melodic touch anchored Ray Parker's guitar, while his soft but expressive vocals became an essential layer in the group's sound. In 1978, Raydio released their debut single, Jack and Jill. The song told the story of a man who stayed home while Jill chased fame, a playful metaphor that resonated with anyone who'd ever felt left behind. It was a runaway success, climbing to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and selling over 1 million copies. For Jerry, it was a moment of quiet triumph. The boy who once played behind others was now part of something heard across the country. That first album, Raydio, went gold and made the group a staple on R&B radio. Audiences couldn't resist their clean grooves and romantic hooks. But inside the studio, it was Jerry's sense of rhythm that gave those songs their heartbeat. Tracks like Is This a Love Thing and You Can't Change That showcased not only Ray's charisma, but also Jerry's subtle genius, the way his bass would sing just enough to make you feel the groove without overpowering it. By 1979, Raydio was everywhere, television, radio, even performing at Madison Square Garden for an anti-nuclear concert. It should have been everything Jerry had ever dreamed of. And yet, there was a quiet ache underneath the success. He loved the music, but he couldn't ignore a truth that followed him everywhere. When people talked about Raydio, they talked about Ray Parker Jr., not Jerry Knight. He wasn't bitter, not yet, but something inside him began to stir. He had melodies in his head, lyrics in his notebook, and ideas that didn't always fit the group's direction. He wanted to say something that was his own. Every artist reaches a moment when they realize they're standing in someone else's shadow. For Jerry, that realization came not with anger, but with resolve. He wasn't going to compete with anyone, he was going to find his own light. And so, in 1980, at the height of Raydio's fame, Jerry Knight made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He walked away from the group, from the security of success, to chase something far riskier, his own voice. He didn't know it then, but that leap would lead him to both his brightest moments and his most painful lessons. When Jerry Knight stepped away from Raydio in 1980, the decision surprised everyone around him. Why would someone leave a group on the rise? But for Jerry, it wasn't about walking away from success, it was about walking toward freedom. He wanted to find out who he was when no one else was leading the song. He soon signed with A&M Records and began crafting what would become his self-titled debut album. For the first time, he had control over the sound, the lyrics, the direction. It was funk with heart, rhythm with vulnerability. He wasn't trying to chase trends, he was chasing truth. When the album Jerry Knight was released, it didn't explode onto the charts, but those who listened could feel something different. His voice carried both joy and weariness, like a man who had seen the cost of chasing a dream. The single Overnight Sensation became his calling card, reaching number 17 on the Billboard R&B chart, and finding a home on late-night radio shows that catered to true soul lovers. The song was smooth, but it had grit, the kind of sound that didn't fade after the first listen. He followed it with Perfect Fit, a song that lived up to its title. It climbed into the R&B Top 20 and became a favorite on dance floors across America. Critics praised his ability to blend groove with sincerity, a rare balance in an era ruled by flash and disco lights. For Jerry, this was validation. Maybe he didn't have the fame Ray Parker Jr. had, but he had something else: respect from those who really listen. His music began to travel quietly. DJs loved the depth of his arrangements, the way every instrument had space to breathe. Fans wrote letters saying his songs felt alive, not mechanical, not polished to perfection, but human. That was what Jerry had always wanted, music that felt honest. Still, as the early 1980 decade unfolded, the industry began to shift. Synthesizers were replacing live musicians, and record labels were looking for flashier stars. Jerry didn't fit that mold. He was a craftsman, not a celebrity. He'd rather stay in the studio until dawn perfecting a bass line than pose for a photo shoot. But even if the spotlight dimmed, his work spoke louder than words. His songs carried soul in every bar, heart in every note. He didn't shout to be remembered, he played to be understood. By the time his second album was released, Jerry had earned a quiet place in the pantheon of real musicians, the ones who built the foundation others stood on. He might never have been the face on the poster, but his sound was already woven into the DNA of funk and R&B. And though he didn't know it yet, his greatest moment and his last true taste of mainstream success was just around the corner. For Jerry Knight, the early 1980 decade became both a proving ground and a quiet celebration of everything he had worked toward. After years of standing in the background, he was finally creating music on his own terms, songs that carried his fingerprints on every chord, every groove, every breath. His first two albums with A&M Records, Jerry Knight and Perfect Fit, may not have topped every chart, but they resonated with listeners who cared about real musicianship. Tracks like Overnight Sensation, Perfect Fit, and She Got to Be a Dancer felt alive, not manufactured, but human. You could feel the sweat of the studio, the pulse of the bass, and the soul of the man behind it all. In those years, Jerry found his rhythm not just musically, but personally. He was performing in small clubs across the country, each night filled with that same electric hum from his early days. The crowds weren't huge, but they were loyal. They came to hear him, not the hits, not the hype, but the heart. His peers in the industry noticed too. Other artists respected Jerry not for how high he charted, but for how real he sounded. His work inspired musicians who were coming up in the R&B and funk scenes, reminding them that music didn't need flash to feel timeless. By 1983, Jerry was ready to take another leap this time with drummer and producer Ollie Brown. Together, they formed Ollie and Jerry, a duo that would unexpectedly catapult him into the mainstream once again. Their chemistry was immediate. Ollie brought the precision and drive of rhythm, while Jerry carried the melody and heart. That same year, the duo recorded the title track for the breakdance-themed film Breakin'. The song, There's No Stopping Us, exploded onto the airwaves. It was more than just a soundtrack hit, it was an anthem of joy and resilience, embodying everything Jerry stood for. The song reached number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100, making it his biggest success since Jack and Jill. For a moment, Jerry Knight was everywhere again. The energy of funk had returned, dressed in the shiny new clothes of early pop. The duo performed on Soul Train, the ultimate symbol of cultural arrival for black musicians in America. Seeing Jerry smiling on that stage, bass in hand, was more than nostalgia, it was redemption. In interviews, he remained humble. "Music should make people feel free," he said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted." He never boasted, never sought headlines. Even in triumph, Jerry carried himself like the same kid who once stood outside studios dreaming of a chance. For a brief, beautiful window, the world finally heard his name again. The lights were bright, the crowd alive, and the music unstoppable. But what Jerry didn't know was that those lights would soon begin to dim, not suddenly, but softly, like the slow fade of a song you wish would never end. After the rush of There's No Stopping Us, the world felt wide open for Jerry Knight. The song had given him something he hadn't felt in years: validation, not just as a musician, but as an artist whose work could still move the masses. The success brought interviews, television appearances, and a new sense of hope. For a while, it seemed like the tide had turned. But the music world, especially in the 1980 decade, was changing faster than ever. The warmth of live funk was giving way to a colder, more synthetic sound. Drum machines replaced drummers, and glossy production began to overshadow the human touch. The same honesty that made Jerry's music real now made it feel old-fashioned to the record executives chasing the next hit. In 1984, Jerry and Ollie Brown released another track for the sequel, Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo. The song carried the same energy, optimistic, bright, full of motion, but the industry's attention had already moved elsewhere. Though it performed modestly in the UK and dance charts, it couldn't replicate the magic of its predecessor. Behind the scenes, Jerry began to feel the subtle chill of being left out. Invitations slowed down, studio calls became fewer. The energy that once surrounded him started to fade. Hollywood had turned its gaze toward new trends, hip-hop, new jack swing, and the electronic edge of pop, funk, once the heartbeat of America's dance floors, was being written out of the story. Jerry felt it deeply, but he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he shifted focus from performing to writing, from stage lights to studio lamps. He began composing and producing for others, channeling his creativity into new voices. It wasn't the same thrill as hearing his own name on the charts, but it kept him close to what he loved most, music. Still, there was a quiet sadness behind his discipline. Those who worked with him during that time said Jerry carried himself with calm dignity, smiling, helpful, always professional, but you could see something in his eyes. The industry had a way of moving on without saying goodbye, and for artists like him, that silence could feel louder than applause. By the late 1980 decade, Jerry's name appeared less and less on record sleeves. Yet, in the background, his influence lingered in the grooves, in the tone, in the musicians he mentored. He didn't chase fame anymore, he chased meaning. He once told a friend, "Music will outlive all of us. If I can leave something honest behind, that's enough." Those words would become prophetic. The man who once filled dance floors with his voice was now learning to live with the quiet that follows when the song ends. And in that silence, the seeds of tragedy began to grow, not through scandal or failure, but through time, through change, through the simple, heartbreaking truth that even the most soulful voices can be forgotten. By the mid-1980 decade, Jerry Knight had learned that fame could be as fleeting as a chorus fading into silence. The same world that once danced to his voice had moved on to a different rhythm. The radio no longer played the warmth of funk and soul. It was now filled with electronic beats, sharp edges, and new faces. But Jerry never blamed the music. He understood the cycle, styles come and go, but truth in sound remains. He quietly accepted his place behind the curtain, working as a songwriter and producer for others. His name might not have been on the marquee, but his fingerprints were still there, hidden within the melodies of a new generation. He began collaborating with emerging acts who needed guidance and experience. Among them was a young pop group called the Jets. Jerry co-wrote several of their early hits, including Crush on You, Curiosity, and Private Number. The songs became radio favorites, helping the Jets rise to prominence. Though his name appeared only in small print on the album credits, those who knew the business recognized his touch-clean production, heartfelt rhythm, and emotional truth. Through the late 1980 decade, Jerry continued to write for others, The Whispers, Natalie Cole, Dionne Warwick, Philip Bailey, and more. He moved quietly between studios, guiding artists with patience and humility. He never demanded attention or credit. He just wanted the music to be right. But behind the calm exterior, life was not easy. The financial rewards for behind-the-scenes work were modest, and the constant motion of the industry could wear anyone down. For someone like Jerry, who once felt the spotlight's heat and the crowd's roar, the silence between sessions could feel endless. Friends later said he rarely spoke about the past. He didn't reminisce about Raydio or Ollie and Jerry, nor did he complain about being forgotten. He kept his memories to himself, like songs he wasn't ready to share again. What he did talk about was the craft bass tones, studio acoustics, arrangements, the technical poetry that only true musicians understood. As the years went by, he began to face a challenge no artist could prepare for. Jerry was diagnosed with cancer, a battle he kept private for as long as he could. Even then, he kept working. There were days he would leave the hospital to go straight to the studio, too proud to let illness define him. He never wanted pity. He only wanted to leave something meaningful behind. In his final years, Jerry's world became smaller, fewer shows, fewer calls, but the same deep love for music never left him. To those closest to him, he was still the same man who once believed his bass could talk. He was, even in struggle, a musician to the very end. In the final stretch of his life, Jerry Knight moved quietly through the same city that had once echoed his sound. Los Angeles had changed new artists, new genres, new rhythms. Yet in small pockets of the city, people still remembered the man whose music once filled dance floors with light. He was still working, still writing sometimes for others, sometimes just for himself. His home studio became his sanctuary. The walls were lined with old records, gold discs, and photographs from better days, mementos of a life that had moved at full tempo once. Visitors said that even when he grew weak, he'd light up whenever he picked up his bass. His hands might tremble, but his timing never did. There was something sacred in the way he approached music, as if every note was a prayer, every sound a memory he refused to lose. But the world outside didn't know. Hollywood had already turned the page. The magazines that once covered his bandmates no longer mentioned his name. For many, Jerry Knight had become a footnote, a talented musician from another time. And yet, that anonymity didn't define him. He was never bitter, never resentful. He often told friends, "If the music lasts, then so do I." It was a statement that revealed the soul of a man who understood that legacy isn't about fame, it's about truth. As the illness progressed, Jerry spent more time with his family. He was a husband, a father of two, and a quiet presence who valued peace over applause. The industry that once demanded his every hour now barely noticed he was gone, but his home was filled with love, laughter, and always music. On the 29th of December 1996, Jerry Knight passed away at the age of 44. The news didn't make major headlines, no long tributes, no public ceremony. It was the kind of departure that felt both unfair and poetic, the quiet exit of a man whose life had always been about sound, not noise. But those who knew, those who remembered, felt the loss deeply. Musicians who had worked with him called it the end of an era. They knew the truth. Jerry wasn't just another name in the credits, he was part of the foundation that gave funk and R&B their voice. In the years that followed, a few collectors and fans began revisiting his work, discovering the warmth and humanity that lived inside every track. Slowly, piece by piece, his legacy began to surface again. Even in death, Jerry Knight was still doing what he had always done, reminding the world that real music doesn't disappear. It just waits to be heard again. For years after his passing, Jerry Knight's name lived mostly in the margins, tucked inside liner notes, whispered among collectors, and kept alive by musicians who understood what he had truly given to the world. In an industry obsessed with fame, he had built something more enduring: respect. His sound carried a warmth that never went out of style. Long before digital perfection became the norm, Jerry's music felt human. Every note had weight, every silence had meaning. His bass lines moved like conversation, subtle but alive, filled with intention. That's what separated him from so many others. He didn't just play rhythm, he was rhythm. Among musicians in Los Angeles, his name was spoken with quiet admiration. Session players remembered him as the man who never raised his voice, who could fix a groove without saying a word. They said his timing was surgical, but his feel was pure soul. That rare combination of discipline and emotion made him a teacher, even without ever calling himself one. When younger artists in the late 1990 decade began rediscovering funk and early R&B, they inevitably found themselves tracing back to Jerry's work through Raydio, through his solo records, through Ollie and Jerry. His influence ran like an undercurrent beneath so many modern acts, even if they didn't know his name. In America, his legacy exists not on award stages or walks of fame, but in the DNA of the music itself. The grooves that inspired a generation to dance in 1978 were the same grooves that echoed decades later in neo-soul and funk revival. Artists like Bruno Mars, Anderson, Pac, and Thundercat, knowingly or not, carry fragments of what Jerry helped create, that balance of tight musicianship and effortless soul. The critics who revisit his catalog today call him a missing link, a bridge between the lush instrumentation of the 1970 decade and the sleek polish of the early 1980 decade. His records, once overlooked, have become collector's gems. Vinyl enthusiasts trade copies of Perfect Fit and Loves on Your Side for their warmth, their honesty, their groove. And across the Atlantic, in the UK and Japan, a quiet revival began. DJs and record diggers in London started spinning Raydio and Jerry Knight tracks at underground funk nights, celebrating the forgotten brilliance of artists who had laid the foundation for what they loved. In Tokyo, rare groove collectors treated his albums as treasures, evidence of an era when music still breathed. It's a strange kind of immortality, not the kind that fills arenas, but the kind that lives in turntables, playlists, and memories. Jerry Knight may not have lived to see the world rediscover his magic, but his sound never left. It lingers in the pulse of a bass line, in the hum of late-night radio, in the moments when music feels alive again. He once said, "If the music is honest, it will find its way back." And somehow, it did. In the years that followed, something remarkable began to happen. A new generation of listeners, raised on digital playlists and algorithmic pop, started to look backward to the era when songs felt handmade, when musicians lived every note they played. And in that search for authenticity, they found Jerry Knight. His voice began to reappear on curated playlists of forgotten funk and underrated soul. Music bloggers wrote about him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. They spoke of the way his songs felt warm, unpolished, human. To younger ears, it was a revelation. Proof that the 1970 and early 1980 decade had birthed artists whose work still breathed with life. In America, critics revisited his discography, calling him one of the architects of quiet groove. They noted how his bass playing influenced generations of R&B musicians who sought to blend melody and rhythm seamlessly. To them, Jerry represented the spirit of a bygone Hollywood, one where talent mattered more than image, and where music came from sweat, not software. Abroad, appreciation grew quietly but steadily. In Europe, DJs began featuring Ollie and Jerry tracks in nostalgic funk sets. The Japanese music press reissued his albums with liner notes that praised his honest sound and gentle genius. Fans who had never known him while he was alive now spoke his name with the same respect they gave to Marvin Gaye or Donny Hathaway, men whose music spoke softly but stayed forever. Even within the American industry, small tributes started appearing. Fellow musicians, those who had shared studios or late-night sessions with Jerry, began telling stories about him. They described a man who was always early, always prepared, always generous with advice. One said, "He never played a note that didn't mean something." That was his quiet gift. While others chased spotlight and sales, Jerry Knight chased truth. And that truth is what made his legacy outlive his career. It's easy to forget artists like him, the ones who built the foundation rather than stood on it. Hollywood often remembers the stars who burned the brightest, not the ones who kept the flame alive. But every so often, a voice like Jerry's returns not as an echo, but as a reminder. A reminder that real artistry doesn't fade. It simply waits for the world to catch up. Today, when a fan somewhere drops the needle on Perfect Fit or streams There's No Stopping Us on a Quiet Night, Jerry's spirit is there, not demanding applause, just smiling, knowing that the music found its way home. He may never have had a star on the Hollywood walk, but his legacy walks with everyone who remembers what soul feels like. Because in the end, Jerry Knight didn't just make music. He made time stand still for those few minutes when a song feels like the truth. The lights have long faded from that Los Angeles stage, but somewhere in the quiet, Jerry Knight's bass still hums steady, soulful, alive. It's the sound of a man who never chased fame, only feeling. A man who believed that even the smallest groove could change the mood of a room, the heartbeat of a listener, the memory of a time. He began as a kid in a city of dreams, armed with nothing but faith and a bass guitar. He rose through soundtracks, sessions, and stages, helping define the pulse of American funk before the world even realized it. His career didn't end with headlines or ceremonies, it ended the way it began, with honesty. There's something deeply American about Jerry Knight's story, not just in the music, but in the spirit. The belief that hard work and heart still matter, even when the spotlight forgets your name. His journey reminds us that not every artist was meant to be a star. Some were meant to be the light behind others, and that, too, is a kind of greatness. If you listen closely, you can still hear him. In every groove that makes you move, in every song that feels like home. That's Jerry still speaking, still teaching, still present in the rhythm of time. His story isn't just a story of loss or fame. It's a story of purpose of a man who gave everything to the craft, and in return, left behind something eternal. The records may gather dust, the names may fade, but the feeling remains. That feeling soulful, steady, alive, is Jerry Knight. So tonight, wherever you are, whether you grew up with his sound or are just discovering it, take a moment. Listen. Remember that behind every hit, every melody that made you smile, there were artists like him, unseen but unforgettable. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Jerry Knight the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help keep his memory alive. Because here, on Stars Underrated, we believe that some stars never fade, they just shine where fewer eyes can see.